Hey y'all, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be discussing how much faster is coding with AI agents from a senior software engineer. That's me. So AI agents have been getting a lot of hype for how good they are at coding, and I think that's like one side of the spectrum. But there are still plenty of naysayers saying that AI can't replace human programmers. Kind of like the other side of the spectrum, who doesn't want to use agents. They're like, the code they output sucks, and that's never going to happen. Now, I've worked professionally as a software engineer for the past 9 years, and I think AI agents are a very powerful tool when wielded correct. And so here I want to share some of my personal data on how much faster they've made me at coding as a full-time software engineer, kind of looking at data from across my career. And the highlight is basically AI agents have increased my throughput by about 3x. So back in the days before agents, this is most of my career, probably like 6 years. And I'd say this is probably how it was before Opus 4 came out, the middle of 2025. I worked up to a point where I was doing about 7 PRs per week. And my goal really was to try and put out about one per day so that I'm always making consistent progress. And typically I could on most weeks do that. And so that's where the 7 PRs per week kind of average came from. And then came along Opus 4. And I really started kind of diving more into these AI agents and using them to actually write the code, not just to, reference code and like as like a replacement for Stack Overflow in Google, but to actually be like, well, why don't you just write it instead of me kind of, copy pasting from here to here and then writing it myself. And this really improved my throughput in the latter half of 2025. I'm getting closer to like 12 PRs per week, which is about 2 per day. And I do want to preface that like not all of these PRs are like necessarily like main work. A lot of this is getting to some, code refactors and things that we would have wanted to do, or, pushing those into the main PRs. And that's kind of like what's going faster. The project's probably received some speed up, but, it's not a one-to-one correlation. And then finally now in the past 6 months, probably since start of 2026 when I really focused on my agentic engineering workflows at Recurse Center. And then now that I'm back at work and I'm really streamlining it for enterprise development, I'm getting closer to 20 PRs per week, which is about 4 per day. And so if you look back on that, time frame of my career, that's about 3x my, manual baseline and about 2x what I was getting even with agents, but with very rudimentary workflows in the early versions of these tools. And if you're curious about like how I'm developing with agents, I have written about my current agentic engineering workflow, which leverages vertical slices, atomic and stacked commits, and my terminal first workflow, kind of why I like all of those. So you can read more about those there. And as we kind of mentioned, there are a lot of caveats for these calculations. And the main one is just that like 3x faster coding does not mean 3x faster engineering. As I mentioned, some of the extra PRs that I'm pushing through each week are really just refactors, improvements of tech debt that I'm finding that in previous cycles I just maybe wouldn't have the time for, I wouldn't prioritize. But now that it's so easy to spin up a new agent to do it, that's probably an extra 1, 2, 3, 4 PRs a week is just doing cleanup. But really software engineering is like way more than just coding, right? It's like choosing what to build. Like if you move really fast and build something, but it's not the right thing to build, like did it matter? It might actually be a net negative that you spent the tokens and now you have this thing that you're maybe holding on to that is useless, versus kind of being like, oh, that's too much work to actually do this thing. Let me spend more time choosing the right thing. Might be a better use of time and energy. Design and architecture are still big. I think AI agents are pretty decent at scoping and designing features, but like they're not great at system design. They're not great at large projects. They don't have the context for it. They're not always great at making good trade-offs for, simple scalable systems, being practical. They always want to like catch all the edge cases, but in doing so, they like make a super over-engineered, over-complex thing that no human is going to be able to understand. We still got planning and coordination, right? What does the team want? What does the org want? They're saying these things, but what do they actually mean? There are some early like AI consensus algorithm stuff that are kind of working, but then also you see how, dark factories and stuff work, and they tend to just spin in cycles and kind of slowly devolve into a ball of mud. So that's not great. And then review and validation. I think AIs are getting much better at this. We use a lot of AI automated things at work, and I basically every single PR that I put up, I use AIs to do first pass reviews on them. But still, there's things that aren't great, and I still think this is the checkpoint that's most useful for finding early drift from what you expect? Have the AI started copying some things that you don't love? Are you surprised that something works the way it does? And so I think these are going away some from humans, but still is probably one of the highest leverage things that we can do every now and then to make sure we still understand the system and it's going in the right direction. And so that's just some caveats about like even thinking about this as a good measure, but also for the measure itself, like there's other things, right? It's just me, my personal data from a couple months. And so your mileage may vary. You probably have different workflow. PRs aren't really a great proxy for impact. Any kind of thing that you start measuring can be super gameable. Throughput's going to change depending on where you are in a project cycle. If you're planning, if you're coding, going to be different throughputs. I prefer atomic commits. And so I often have small PRs, and I've been pretty consistent with that for like the past 5-ish years, I would say. But for other people, they might choose to just throw it all in one big PR, and they both have their trade-offs. They're better in different situations. And so even just like comparing PR throughput from person to person isn't always that useful. And then I think we already talked about coding is only part of the job, but I think one of the big ones right now that's top of mind for me is that quality is important and very hard to measure. Again, just like building the wrong thing quickly is probably a net negative, so too is building something that doesn't have good quality, because you're going to have to come back and fix it later. Both AI agents, they copy what you've already done, and so any kind of like bad practices that get in the code base today are going to multiply much faster than they did in the past. And so these are all things that like are top of mind for me, is like this isn't a great measure, but I still think the data is. And I think it is useful because, if we assume that the other factors are relatively consistent, and because I'm looking back at my own data over time, I do think that it does a decent job, at least like trend wise and relatively, of showing like how much faster this part of the process is going. And if we assume that you need a similar level of the other things to actually get that throughput, I do think it's an okay proxy at like what is the whole factory assembly line, if you will, doing. So AI hasn't made my whole software engineering job 3 times faster, but it has made one major part of it coding about 3x faster. And so like maybe we're not 3x faster, but like are we 1.5x faster? Probably. 2x? Maybe. But again, it's hard to tell. Hard to A/B test projects, companies. You're not the same company. These aren't the same projects that we're working on. Now, in my experience, coordination has always been the biggest bottleneck in large organizations, but coding was still a bottleneck. And I think that's really clear with, how it's changing organizations already. And at this point, I'm finding that bulk coding is largely solved. The code may not always be the best. It may not always be exactly what I would do, but it's typically serviceable, and it can get very good fast with a few intentional review passes. So it's like, I wouldn't use that there. I would actually use, a functional pipeline. I just tell it that, boom, it makes a functional pipeline. Great. And I also think we need to be honest with ourselves. Like most of the code that we shipped at work previously, like wasn't the best code either, right? Actually trying to get the best perfect code was never a good return on investment. And so like we need to be comparing what we're doing now to what we were doing then. And I think we were mostly writing good code then. We were making good trade-offs. The AI is writing okay code, but how fast, or what's the actual like cycle time to get that AI code from okay to good? We shouldn't be trying to get the AI code from okay to perfect, basic. And that's kind of like what we need to be measuring when we're comparing. And then, what I'm finding is that we are shifting more of the bottleneck pressure to planning, coordination, and review. I think AI is massively parallelizable. And so if we can get the quality higher, if we can get the other parts of the software engineering cycle to have less high touch while still keeping the quality bar as high, I think we could do a lot more within the engine. And that's kind of why I'm currently finding the highest leverage human work is really choosing the right thing to build, shaping the overall design and architecture, and trying to find a way to do it with quality at the speed of AI. I think that's the really hard one. Humans, like, I don't know, we have a bottleneck of like how fast we can consume information, think about it deeply, and then get a good thing coming out of it. And so figuring out where do we fit in this pipeline, if we even fit in this pipeline, I think it's going to be a much different role over time, is going to be really key for the industry in the next few years, and for software engineers to try and stay relevant. So I'm actively thinking about how to improve these bottlenecks, and what does this mean for my career? What are the things we should be focused on? And so let me know if you have thoughts, because I'd be very curious to see where other people are at. And the final shout out is if you want to see the setup I have or I use for agentic engineering, at work and on side projects, I do snapshot my AI dot files each month for Minions members, so you can join there and get access to it. Now, if you like this post, you might also like how to balance speed, quality, and mental overhead in agentic engineering. This this is currently how I'm thinking of my personal processes for managing these agents and, still staying close to the code. Might also be interested in how much I spend on AI agents as a software engineer and whether I think it's worth it. This is works money, so it's a lot more than I would pay myself, but interesting data. And then finally, why high-level Rust wins over the other high-level languages for agentic engineering, and why for my side projects, when I have a choice, I typically choose Rust. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next